Alright, so this is a new recording. Let's first talk about how this is going to work. It's for your cars. I need to let you know. It's my dog likes to play around. So, when you brake with your vehicle, you usually have a brake disc pad and a brake disc. And you're still going to have a version of this, but this is going to be different because, well, we're going to have a pressurized vessel, a cylinder, and then there is going to be a diaphragm in that you are going to have your vehicle's weight and momentum with the tires ultimately push, right? To be able to store it on one side as a vacuum. Of course, it's more about stored inside of the pressure, right, as a spring. Except I'm not actually wanting any pressure in any way at all, but there's always going to need to be pressure somewhere to be able to make that work, right? And then I realized, no, you don't. And I'll have to explain that as I go along with this. So it's more understandable, really, realistically, how I would do something like that. Because vacuums are something that are really only able to do anything unless there's something on one side and the other side. It's simply an intermediary that doesn't really act on things unless it's in a very small or large scale that we're talking about. And so I realized, well, I can actually make that type of scaling here work for me for this type of system. Not quantum stuff, though, just a version of it. And so a vacuum pressure is what we tend to go with, but it's an acceleratory force of some kind behind the vacuum is what you would think of it as. That would be either pushing it because there's a high amount of pressure there, or behind us, and so it's pulling us in that kind of sense, right? But that's really not what that would be if, well, our version of observations are to be believed that have no idea what that could be or where it is. I'm just sort of stating that because it doesn't really make much logical sense, but it doesn't really have to. But then it's like a clear, you know, glaring hole in our current observations as to how it is that we think of quantum vacuum pressure. Which is kind of weird that nobody really talks about it, but it's like, so how the hell would we see the other side of this, thing that isn't there? You know what I mean? Because that's kind of what that would be, right? So, anyways, whole other thing because it's like, well, right now the current understanding is like this, and so we'll just have to say that it's somehow doing this. Wouldn't that just be a consuming force, though? Because at that point it's like doing something and converting it into an expansionary type of force, but because of our relative perspective in view of it, it looks like very little, but to us, that is nothing to it. You know what I mean? Like, that's right. Like, it looks like very little, but that's just because it's not made of stuff that we are made out of. At that point, it looks like a vacuum, but then it's not a vacuum, and it's doing something that we just don't know what it's doing. You know what I mean? It's just a very weird cop out for ultimately. I don't really know, and there's a several answer type of thing that this could ultimately be, but we're gonna go with quantum vacuum pressure. That's literally how I view it. Just as an FYI. But it's like, no, I don't really have to deal with that way. You know what I mean? In this kind of sense, because like that's a much different type of thing than this is just a car that needs to brake. You know what I mean? So we're just gonna focus on that one first. Foremost, I started this off by saying I'm gonna have threads, and the disc brakes are gonna act a little bit like CVTs in my last recording, which you didn't hear. But it's like no, and that's not a good way to put this. And instead of using standard fields, which would be dumb to do because they definitely get worse the further away you go, so that wouldn't make sense. It's effectively like you might try and guess this, what I'm about to say, but you're probably going to have to listen to the entire thing to really know how any of it would work. Which is one of the reasons why I want to talk about the whole quantum vacuum pressure briefly, because there's several ways of interpreting a quantum vacuum pressure as to having the ability to do what it's doing. Alright? Which means there's a eventuality of us discovering exactly what that is, but that's not what we have right now. We say we do, we don't. Any physicist worth their salt, in the deep and nitty gritty of it, will tell you very much that we actually don't know if it's a consuming conversionary force or if there's a pressure difference somewhere else that's helping that happen. That either came from a Big Bang moment or was there before the Big Bang. Anyone that tells you they know is lying to you because there's no evidence at all to any of it. So, we're going to talk about how instead of moving something, we're going to store this energy in a vacuum. Now, there are several ways to do this, and so we're going to go over those first before you'll actually be able to know what I'm doing. So then you can maybe grasp how I arrived to what I'm going to do for this. Now, there's a pressure on one side, and that is now a spring, so long as there's a vacuum on another. Because it adds something to expand into. Right? Now, it can do work energy, and there is loss. That's piezoelectrics. With a given amount with copper and series and parallel in the right areas, you have now produced what is effectively a type of cooler Stirling type effect. Because you're going to be consistently breaking over and over, right? And let's say you wanted to make it a little better for you by having it more or less become a part of your suspension system. That's a way you could go about trying to compactify your given vehicle's braking and suspension. Not a bad idea. It doesn't work very well. Just as an FYI, it is okay, it's fairly efficient, and you get a lot of that energy back. And it weighs less than any electrical resistive type of braking. Energy recovery kind of thing, right? E-braking. It weighs less, and it'll be more efficient as a result. But that's not a very good way to go about it, for what it's worth. And it needs to be serviced. The O-rings for the seals will break down. A lot of it's just a bunch of I don't like, effectively. So, then you have another sliding style, which would be two flat plates, and then your plates in the middle. And you can move it through, and you can create a given type of potential energy here using a vacuum and a bunch of charge differences that will naturally be there because we're talking about a type of magnet slash it's effectively just a material. Yeah, as I like to think of it as. That's not really what people would call it, but that's all that would really be. But it's essentially like a railgun-esque potential energy storage. All right, so as it goes through, it loads itself up using the vacuum in front, but then it's creating during that moment a energy storage to get itself to go back. That can go back into the engine as a result, as work energy, effectively. Right, but then it's just a linear generator, like literally that, yeah. Which is lame, and it's complicated, although it'll last a lot longer, and you don't need any O-rings anymore. Ever. No real servicing to it at all. So, that's not terrible, but that's not what I'm doing. I'm going to go over a few more, because then if you look at a tire here, there's pressure here. As you try and ultimately have it slow down, you can use the pressure of the tire and a vacuum introduced, because while there's air there, we don't want to change the volume of the internal volume of the tire. But you know what we can do is use an internal volume relative to the internal volume of the tire. So while it will definitely hook up to the little nozzle you use to fill it up, it'll just use that as a valve for that given pressure seen to the relative vacuum that you'll have stored somewhere else. Now you've made it even lower amounts of weight and even more efficient for you. It'll just be stored within the rim. Not terrible. Now it's more balanced. Right? But that's not what I'm going to do. You can see where I'm going with this. Because it's essentially pressure one side, air spring, vacuum to that. Now the tires, when you get back up and going again, will simply just use this stored energy to get yourself going once more. Which is good, because you should still have the same grip, and you should still have the same feel, and it'll be less weight, and much more easily serviceable as a result. Now it seems like a perfect, why wouldn't you do it, right? This is like, there's pressure somewhere, and I don't like that. Yeah, that's literally all it is. Like, it's that, yeah, so I don't like pressure somewhere else. So I'm going to make the vacuum be my pressure. This is condensing styles, like what cold fusion attempted to do. Alright, they heated up something to squeeze little tiny areas to have massive pressures, and then they, under lower heats, would then be able to produce heliums, is what they were going with. And as a result, they would get energy out of the helium as it had fused, and it has heat to it, right? Well, this is not that, but this is essentially a version of that. So, as I draw out relative to the atmosphere, we're going to be using piezoelectrics, yeah. There is now a greater and greater increase of vacuum inside of a tube. But instead of the tube, it's very much more like what I just talked about for the tire situation. It's in the rim. All right, but also in the disc brake, because truthfully, they're going to be very similar, one and the same in this instance. A part of each other. Right? Now, the easiest way to describe how this works is as you try and brake, it takes a given movement and it changes a given amount of, instead of this going outwards, kind of like spokes in a wheel, all right, so that way it's just fine turning, to then it tries to condense that, so it squeezes it relative to outside with piezoelectrics in the rim, and the tire pressure is not involved. Okay? It then means as it squeezes, because it has to slow down somewhere. Alright, so you have to bear with me, because we're going to make it colder versus hotter. Yeah, the opposite. Heat is going to be removed during this. Alright? Which is why I call it condensing. So, if you're trying to guess, most likely I'm feeling that, and that's one of the reasons why I'm slowing down. So you basically sit down and listen. Big long pause there, because I'm sure some of you were laughing at that. But the basic premise here is different to what most would imagine it to be. So, now I told you to imagine spokes coming down. That's not what this is. This is not what's going on. And just like with e-braking, there would have to be this idea of fields for some of you, and no, none of that's being done at all. And yes, it is in the rim. It's using angular momentum. If you were a Scott Manley guy, you got it. Smarties out there do know what that is. Angular momentum is what this is. It's a type of reverse Hall effect. See, as something is spun up like a flywheel and then expands, it slows down. But in so doing, you get work energy, a return of the angular momentum. Of course, I'm not going to be doing anything like that, because of course I'm not going to be working on individual atoms. This is just a genuine thing moving inside of the rim. So, now, movement of a tire has to be conserved into a given vacuum here. Movement, in this instance, has to be perceived differently. Angular momentum, as it's moving from out towards in, has to be conserved in a different manner than what you're used to. We're going to be squeezing something during that process. Piezoelectrics aren't actually going to send energy anywhere at all. They're going to be seen as potential energy inside of the vacuum. So it's a linear but not linear generator. I'm not going to be having anything continuously spin. I don't need to. And I will 100% be condensing something. It's going to be a little complicated to describe this, so I'm going to need you to really sort of hold on and listen. It's different than most normal people, and their perceptions of how best to do something like this. This would be cheap as fuck to make and really easy to do. It's a plate to plate, with you ultimately shrinking something in that moment, because you have to break something, right? And so you're going to be moving the fluid away from the brake fluid, away from the center of where your wheel is. Now, I'm going to have to pause this, and I'll get back to it. I need to describe this really well, so that way you can grasp it quickly. Let's first discuss what the Hall effect is. Alright? It's a electromagnetic field produced during movement of a given electron in its orbit. Okay? Just as an FYI. Now, when you add in piezoelectrics, as they squeeze they have to then produce energy somewhere. A reverse Hall effect means they went into a higher orbit. But they cannot do that as easily when they're structured around that, like the cold fusion type of thing that I'm talking about. Not to mention, it usually produces heat, but when there's a bunch of Hall effects around that are now there, instead of capacitive or linear generation, which can't be done, and we're cooling it. Energy has to go into the vacuum instead of heat energy, though, which it can't do. It has to produce the opposite, expansionary energy. Now, because there's now a area for it to expand, of course it just does that, as it'll squeeze inwards and condense and cool off during that. It expanded what was inside and cooled itself, using the Hall effect as a reverse Hall effect. But I get that energy storage instead of linear generation because there's no electromagnetic fields here, as a change of outright potential energy for a given size and shape of volume. Alright. Now, a best way to describe this is the resultive reduction in the internal diameter volume to the storage that is the movement during your break here is negligible to most, but not to the thing that is it, to its relative size and volume. It has other places to expand as it is plated in such a way that now they're connected. And so the gap has been removed. Let's put this really plain and simple. It's going to remove a lot of heat as a result of doing that. It cools off very significantly. It's using that movement of your tires to remove heat because it's a change of relative pressure in size, like ideal gas law, Joule-Thomson, Stirling, and quite a few other different 1800s scientists trying to discover thermal and fluid dynamics. But now it's in a physical, solid property as a pressure wave, instead of needing it to be in a gas. It's now in a solid form. And because fields also can be a part of that Hall effect, they can also do that. Orbit expanded, and so it condensed in that sense of cooling off. Became more ordered and more pressured as a result, which is the very definition of it got colder. So, simple stuff. If you don't understand how that works, I'm baffled because I just told you how that works. Now, the energy has to ultimately go back. That's the reason why it's a recovery energy system for your braking. Right? Now, the reason why piezoelectrics are here is because they elicit the opposite of electricity when electricity is put back into them. Because they're structured the right way, they will then move back into place, and while they do that, they then take the movement of going back and the plate that's going to expand and slide during this moment as movement to the wheels. And of course, it gets more torque as it expands outwards because there's more leverage, which is fine because, truthfully, you're going to get the opposite as the plates that are around it apply the greater torque to the wheel as it moves, and then they have less torque as the movement of the internal plate expands outwards and allows for more torque to then be applied to the movement of the wheels, making it more like a CVT and more consistent as a result. You get no return on investment because I don't need to. It's going to take energy from your movement of the wheel, but also, for what it's worth, there's heat in our atmosphere. There's heat with light. And in general, there's pressure in our atmosphere too, which is why this helps so much. It would do this anyways without pressure in atmosphere, just as an FYI, as the vacuum's internal diameter volume relative to the pressure of the solid material inside allows for expansion thanks to the given the reverse Hall effect, angular momentum change, and the piezoelectric storage as mechanical energy storage. It's insanely highly efficient because piezoelectrics are 90% efficient. The Hall effect is very, very efficient too, and so is what is essentially a never-touching, gapped series of plates that are in a vacuum. So there's no frictional losses. Which means I don't have the issues most people do for this ginormous weight and complex braking system for energy, for electrical, energy recovery braking for any electric motor based engines or cars, motors, that kind of thing, because that's a lot of material that is hard to source, and China's really kind of the only one. And then it's expensive material on average to produce in mass. And I was like, I want to remove all of that. I want easy, ready to source, already ubiquitous everywhere materials that I can mass manufacture very quickly, very cheaply, with no trouble whatsoever. Piezoelectrics are basically everywhere. Hall effects are literally on practically any material because it's electron orbits. All you have to do is structure the piezoelectrics correctly through any material you really can kind of get that will hopefully allow for the correct type of Hall effect expansion, which truthfully are almost any solid material that's light enough. So any light material will probably be just fine which eventually turns into some carbon. Probably, yeah, I would imagine graphite could do it. Aluminum. I mean, aluminum is expensive though, so I mean, yeah, you start getting where I come from on it, because after a while, it's like, well, anything, any garbage, a plastic material, anything. I know, you know what I mean? It's like literally, you just have to structure the piezoelectrics correctly. That's it. But like that one's a whole other can of worms, because it turns into, well, the plates have to be properly gapped. They still have to have some contact, and it has to slide through as they expand. And then that has to allow for the internal expansion, which it's just gapping, but a whole bunch of other stuff that allows for. So if you're able to imagine it in your head, or at least putz around on a little bit of a computer-aided design website or any program, you can probably imagine it as a series of plates that have a couple of just sliding rods that are gapped properly. Alright, so, well, rod will be good enough, but it doesn't really matter. There are multiple ways to do this type of design, and that's why I'm like, well, the way you're going to structure your piezoelectrics also changes as a result. So it's a free-for-all, for what it's worth, as to how you want to accomplish it. But for me, I go very simple, very fast. Don't try and play around with, like, complicated. Like, complicated sucks. Do it fast, do it quick, make it easy to do this in mass. You know what I mean? Like, brute force. Just simple is better, right? So, the reason why I talk about it being plates is because people can understand plates. But I don't use plates, if I'm being honest. I use vacuums as if they're bearings, and I use floating designs because they're able to be stored like that, thanks to the fact that they're going to be able to be held up for an external, right, kind of like an exoskeleton in that sense, right, versus the thing that's going to be moving down, right, and as they change and they shrink, it's kind of like a spring, right? So it's like, it is like a spring, but then it's like, this isn't spring that's unlike any other spring you probably have seen before, for what it's worth, because instead of it being mechanical, it never uses mechanical. It never uses pressure, and it technically never uses any fields ever to do any of the work, and it gets colder when you use it. So, that one is the reason why it's near and dear to my heart. I can move this over with a little, brake system. As I plunge this out, it moves it further away. That shrinks it down. The plate simply just shrinks down. You can do many different versions. You can have it squeeze in. You can have it head towards the center. You can have it head towards the outside. There's too many dang ways. All right. I'm not going to tell you mine, mostly because if you want to make it, it'd be awesome to see what you come up with. Personally, my design is still in the refinement stage. It's not in a place where I feel comfortable sharing. That's what that is. The concept is good enough to share. The design I currently have is not good enough to share. That's what that is. Alright? But the reason why I like this system is because it's less weight, less complication, and it's easier to get return of that storage directly with much less loss to the wheels. And it's very, very robust and reliable for very long periods of time without any need to ever service it, which is great. That's why I like it. Now, this while long-winded, is not very long-winded to me. Just a whole bunch of other individuals, most likely trying desperately to figure out what it was I was going to come up with. And so I had to wait for them to be quiet, listen all the way through, and see if they would have gotten it. Like I said, to be able to understand all of this, they probably had to listen to the entire thing all the way through. Alright. I'm going to record something else. This will be tied back to the vacuums for the next recording here.